First up, we have our panelist, Joseph Rojas Jr. Joseph is a first-year MA student in Latin American Studies working on the LGBTQ/sexuality studies track within the WGS Graduate Portfolio Certificate Program. His research interests include transnational queer identity formation, queer digital and popular cultures, queer migration, and queer urban space, particularly in the Brazilian Northeast. Everyone, please help me welcome Joseph Rojas Jr.
And then thank you so much for the introduction. Am I already able to share my screen or?
You should be able to. If not,
Okay.
let us know.
Okay, perfect. I'll just I have to open it and then. Okay, I'm showing it here, and then is everyone seeing it already? Okay, perfect. Okay, so thank you so much for the introduction. So my paper today I'm presenting is Queer Cearense Transcultural Landscapes, Glitter em busca de sonho. So Cearense here refers specifically to Ceará, which is a state in northeastern Brazil where I lived in 2019. And then Glitter is a sort of loosely drag race inspired reality television show that aired there that I used as a case study in my paper. And just sort of jump right into it. Where I pull sort of transcultural landscapes from is from Brazilian scholar Denilson Lopes. And I prefer to sort of think with that term in the paper just because it's very versatile. It allows you to sort of hold contradictions. It's really fluid as a term. And I can think with both geographic spaces, more than geographic spaces where people are kind of living and socializing, often transnationally. And so I'm interested in sort of when we specifically queer these landscapes and think about how with mass media and popular culture, even though it's useful for plenty of other spheres, that they can serve as sort of vehicles for shrinking the distance between people that are actually geographically quite distant, and how with mass media and popular culture in particular, you then have sort of nodes of cultural influence that with people simultaneously consuming them in various different places can kind of foster or facilitate creating sort of a sense of belonging or group identity. And so I'm understanding the series itself in my paper as sort of a translocal interpolation of global images of drag culture that's simultaneously hyperlocal, but also has these other influences. And then the other reference that I kind of am mostly thinking with when I was writing the paper was Garcia Conclini's "Consumption is Good for Thinking," which importantly, just as an essay, argued against the sort of irrationality of the consumption of the masses, in quotes. But also for this conference, I think a sub-argument of his that's probably most important is essentially that consumption is sort of a process by which desires are kind of converted into demands or socially regulated acts. And then for me in particular in this paper, he provides a sociocultural kind of theory of consumption that thinks of various categories, ethnicity, class, and so on, as sort of categories that sort of delineate interpretive communities. And he focuses specifically on the nation, and Denilson Lopes kind of builds on that in the other paper. And so following from that, I'm sort of thinking of queer and trans similarly as categories that can kind of delineate transnational consumer communities to a degree. And then to just provide sort of global and national context, just because obviously if we're thinking of transcultural landscapes, this will be very important. And so it sort of goes almost without saying that the primary global influence here is Drag Race. A producer of the show sort of explicitly stated that it was loosely Drag Race inspired, even though the format is not the same. And it's the show itself now has franchises in like 11 I think, different countries. And so you have that same kind of delineation by nation and sort of by queer, trans, drag, and so on subcultures kind of happening in these different media markets. And then Netflix, other streaming platforms, YouTube, Twitch, just the hundreds of millions of people that are using these platforms, which at least in some countries, Drag Race or other very queer or trans coded shows that find transnational appeal are often also on these platforms. And then in Brazil in particular, there's been just a massive increase in internet access / use, and then also sort of an unknowable number of millions of people probably with more and more ways to watch things for free, whether it's pirated or illegal. And so that's kind of the global setting that this is like arising in. And then whether that it's the context that glitter kind of came about in, or rather kind of contributed to. In Brazil specifically, there's just been this explosion of content produced by queer and trans artists. So you have Drag Race in 2008, Glitter, the first season's coming out in 2012, and then somewhere around 2016, you start seeing the early rise of the career of a lot of queer and trans artists. Two of the most famous are on the Vogue covers here, Pablo Vittar and Gloria Groovy, who are pop stars as well as drag queens who have some of the largest followings worldwide. Like I'm pretty sure Pablo has more Instagram followers than like RuPaul herself. One has a show on Netflix, the other has a show literally coming out today on HBO Max. There are a number of other series as well, even though Drag Race hasn't been able to make a Drag Race Brazil happen just yet. And so that's sort of, I guess glitter is sort of loosely, because it came before, kind of influenced that now, as well as musicians and other types of performers that have come about. And then to get into glitter specifically as a show, I'll just kind of go through a handful of points that I touch on in the paper to varying degrees. But its local context is that it's in Fortaleza, which is the capital of that state. And it's airing on Sundays of all days, which I feel like is a sort of symbolic day to have this very sort of queer show. And then it was broadcasted by CWGS, which very much identifies itself and is a very regional and specifically Northeastern broadcasting station. And it aired initially in 2012 and 2014, and then now it's exclusively on YouTube. It has at least 2 more seasons. I think it's still going. And then when it opens, you have this really interesting dynamic in the co-hosts, because you have Enio Carlos, which very different from having like a Black drag queen in RuPaul, is a cis straight man and white or light-skinned Brazilian. And then Lena Oxa as a trans woman who was working at the station at the time, who fought to get the show started. And Enio was like, oh, sure, I would host a show like that. And it does provide a sort of interesting set of dynamics to observe while you're watching. I, in the paper, highlight especially the first episode, just because I was kind of assuming it would introduce all of the contestants, the layout of the show, you get an idea of how they're interacting with one another. And while like not entirely perfect and sort of attenuated by the fact that he's obviously a TV host, like extremely congenial, gives people the spotlight, asks very earnest questions, like engages in sort of fake flirtation with some of the contestants. Like other than in a few instances, always uses she, her stage names, chosen names, even asks Lena Oxa because one of the contestants is a go-go dancer. And so he's like, oh, should I use the masculine or should I use the feminine? Which I think, especially in 2012, just to see that dynamic on television in a state, within a region, within a country where there's a lot of violence against gender non-conforming people, was probably a somewhat significant sort of dynamic to see play out on television. And then beyond that, there are sort of various other indicators of kind of the social realities of gender non-conforming people in Ceará, at least in 2012. And I think while it's probably changed to some degree, living there in 2019, those realities were certainly still there. But the setup of the show, Em Busca de Sonho, is in search of a dream. So rather than $100,000 or reais or whatever, the prize is having a dream fulfilled. and five of them want their own beauty salon. 2 of them would like a house. 6 of them are already cosmetologists as far as their like profession, and then 2 of them are makeup artists. Another's a drag performer. And I don't know, but between that set of dreams and then their professions, you could interpret that as either that there are very few economic spheres where gender nonconforming people could find employment, or that they're at least sort of gravitating towards spheres where they're feeling more accepted. And Lena Oksa in particular, even at one point, because there were 2 contestants who decided to quit just before the show started, and they were replaced by 2 other contestants. And she's sort of just out loud kind of, oh, like, what a shame, and is thinking about it out loud. And she suggests that it would be fear that might have held someone back, the sort of social consequences of being on a show like this. And a show that like is repeatedly, I think at least 4 times in the first episode alone, Enio Carlos or Lena highlights, oh, like this is the first show in Brazil that is exclusively drag, gay, and trans contestants, even though the Enio in particular just kind of always says drag queens, even though there's a host of kind of different words and identities that the contestants have. And then there's also you can kind of see in this picture here as like a promo, how very like photoshopped, like the editing is like very low budget, and this kind of gives an idea of the type of vignettes that they were using to introduce each of the contestants, which had music playing in the background. And you have these sort of very queer and transnational kind of sounds throughout this first episode, where you have both just sort of like kind of almost quintessential kind of nightlife sounds of like dance pop, electronic, a Brazilian a Brazilian genre that is electronic but infused with sort of Brazilian genres, rasteirinha. But then you also have like Listen by Beyonce was playing in the background, Dancing Queen by ABBA was playing in the background. And then later on, after the introductions, you had, I think it came out either the year before or that same year, but like a Pitbull song that was like famous at the time, that had a bunch of like 3 or 4 featuring artists, who between all of them, they're African American, they're Cuban American, they're Dutch and Surinamese, they're Brazilian. So there's just this very, this sonic experience on this hyper regional show that is sort of very queer coded and transnational at the same time. And then while like sort of standard fare for a competition reality show that there's going to be like drama, in Drag Race, that's reading and shade, and that is certainly true for glitter. But I one part of the paper I highlight specifically how that's very much done in a hyper particular way, in the sense that they're using Cearense and other region specific language at the same time as they're using queer or trans kind of slang and other linguistic conventions that are kind of typical of queer and trans people in Brazil simultaneously. And so you have just this very like uniquely queer Cearense type of expression, both in language and also like sort of bodily performance and other things throughout that I highlight. And then just lastly, the sort of influence of the show, I sort of touched on how it seems to have been kind of a precursor to this explosion of content. And to this day, if you follow like a number of gay meme pages that are Brazilian or Northeastern Brazilian specifically, 10 years later, it's this first cast from this first season has memes that just keep being recirculated and reused. And they didn't necessarily become like super wealthy or nationally famous outside of this kind of cult following. But at least one contestant has like a series of her own in Ceará now. Between them, depending on the social media platform, they have anywhere from a handful of thousand to 100,000 followers, which they use to book gigs or to do other. They have various careers now, but they a lot of them still perform. And so then you have this kind of starting out as like an online experience, and this is true of Drag Race as well, where it starts out as like people watching the show, but then you actually have people meeting up in physical places to want to see these people perform or to participate in these various subcultures. And so there's that relational aspect as well. And I think I might be running out of time, but just lastly, the main book that has come out about this was a collection of essays that came out in 2017. 2 out of like 15 or so essays are about Brazil specifically, which I think just kind of speaks to the influence of the Brazilian fandom, which is what the first of the 2 essays is about. And so again, this kind of delineation by both gendered or sexualized kind of subcultures and nation simultaneously as like a transnational consumer community. The like, please come to Brazil. It's Brazilian fans put that. If anyone posts anything online, you're gonna have a Brazilian in the comment section putting that in, saying, come to Brazil. And then the second one, which I think was the more interesting of the 2 for me specifically, was basically highlighting this sort of like identity formation and like how people perform in digital spaces as well. And then they highlight various fan pages and sort of the intermingling of references between Drag Race and Glitter. So you'll have a fan page where it's like transposing the audio in Portuguese, an argument between 2 of the most like famous contestants, and then like transposing it onto video of a fight between Fifi O'Hara and Sharon Needles from season 4 on Drag Race. And then in the comment section, this very uniquely, they'll highlight a few comments of very queer Brazilian kind of language playing around with the scene. And so you have both this sort of like highlighting the sharedness across, you know, countries, I suppose, or outside of at least less delineated by nation of queer performativities of various kinds, while also not having to give up and very much actively engaging in a sort of hyper local or region specific, language specific, culture specific kind of performance of your own, which was kind of the, you know, the main point of the paper. And so that's all I'll say. I think I went over.
Yeah, thank you so much, Joseph. That was,
Yeah, thank you.
yeah, thank you again for such like an insightful presentation. Up next we have Catherine Tairo Quispe. I'm also excited to introduce another scholar working in Peru, Silvana, who will be our next panelist. Silvana Scott her is a 3rd-year PhD student in comparative literature who studies queer and trans Latinx in Peruvian cultural productions. Theoretically, Silvana focuses on varying regimes of the human and their intersections with liberalism, aesthetics, and the nation state. Everyone, please help me welcome Silvana.
Thank you, Mamtaz. Can y'all hear me? Okay, cool. I also wanted to shout out that I'm at the GSC if anybody wants to come, just in general. Cool, I'm gonna share my screen now. Okay, so the title of my presentation is Debunking the Promises of Peruvian Multiculturalism in Yana's Marca Peru. The independent queer Afro-Peruvian artist named Yana condemns the structural discrimination queer and Black communities face in Peru through oppositional aesthetics and provocative political commentaries that stray away from what distinguished scholar and novelist Sylvia Wynter terms man's project. Yana uses dynamic beats and powerful lyrics of the musical genre Fese Trap that combines reggaeton, dancehall trap, and Afro-Peruvian instruments and rhythms to critique state-sponsored race and gender-based violence in her single Marca Peru. I use Marca Peru to analyze the ways in which liberalism and its iterations of multiculturalism and racial capitalism are reflected in cultural productions on mainstream platforms. These representations erroneously mistake the map for the territory, in quote, on how we mistook the map for territory and re-imprison ourselves in on our bearable wrongness of being, Black studies towards the human project, end quote. Wynter demonstrates how a linear notion of progress mistakenly uses changes in the map as opposed to the territory and calls a re-examination of the man and human categories to disalienate Black populations and to create a world that recognizes their inherent being. Wynter emphasizes the importance of rethinking aesthetical value in visual culture and on analyzing Black subalienation as part of the overrepresented genre, specific truth of the human. In Wynter's article, she argues that the creation of the man relies on, quote, the systemic devalorization of racial Blackness, which exists in the, quote, map, and thus is only a symptom or function of the, quote, enacted institutionalization of our present genre of the human, man, and its governing socio-economic code, the territory, end quote. Since the quote, systemic devalorization of racial blackness, end quote, exists dialectically with the overvalorization of whiteness and its other markers, cis, white, heteronormative, etc., the systemic revalorization of Black populations will inadvertently revalorize the human category itself. Winter thus urges us to, quote, exoticize the West, end quote, and to diverse from all genre-specific truths of the human, which also include constructions of gender and the citizen, which were historically indispensable to sociogenic kinds of being human. To support her analysis, Winter looks at how the original liberatory aim of the Black aesthetics, Black arts, and Black studies movements of the 1960s were sanitized and collapsed into the first iterations of Black studies in new multicultural terms with its rebranding to, quote, African American studies. The end of these movements saw alternative, not oppositional change that, while providing essential material forms of survival and access, still relied on Western frameworks of Blackness belonging to the human category. Winter urges that quote, negative connotations, end quote, like race, are ideologies or isms which belong in the map. These matters need to be recognized as part of the larger genre of the human where the, quote, territory lies. In an attempt not to revalorize genre-specific truths of the human, every single word Yana crafts directly challenges the liberalism behind the Marca Peru brand, constructions of Peronidad, and its compliance in the continued oppression of queer and Black communities. Even at first glance, Yana does not censor national forms of belonging through her name, which means Black in Quechua, as a way not only to acknowledge her Blackness as Afro-Peruvian, but also her indigenous roots as well, both of which are systemically marginalized in the mestizo criollo nation state. Through sonic curation of festitrap, oppositional aesthetics, and disruptive lyrics, Yana debunks nation-state promises of multiculturalism and of Peronidad that are tethered to constructions of the human. Afro-Peruvian scholar Ana Lucia Mosquera Rosado examines Peronidad as, end quote, established social structure that privileges criollo white elites and vanishes the opportunities for non-white groups to highlight their own culture or construct their own identities, end quote. Looking at national constructions of Peronidad and its centering of criollonidad and whiteness in comparison to US constructions of Latinidad that are similarly predicated on anti-Blackness and anti-indigeneity, offers a way to examine how Latinidad creates an illusory identificatory cohesiveness that is historically, socially, and economically bounded to the colonial project, which was predicated on the subjugation of indigenous and Black populations. Yana's music illuminates how the relatively new construction of Latinidad is based off the institution of racial and colonial hierarchies that paved the way for national Latin American projects of blanqueamiento and mestizaje. The title of the song Marca Peru, which is never repeated in the lyrics, is referencing the national brand Marca Peru or Brand Peru that is part of the initiative started by the Peruvian Ministry of Foreign Trade and Tourism in partnership with various corporate Peruvian companies and startups to, quote, promote the purchase and consumption of products created in Peru and to boost tourism, exports, and attract investments using branding and neuromarketing, end quote. This brand and initiative heavily relies on multiculturalism and diversity, promoting contexts such as Machu Picchu and the overall diverse ethnic makeup and traditions of the country. Yana's music video, which is mostly filmed in the working class areas of San Miguel and El Callao in the Peruvian capital Lima, visualizes how multiculturalism functions through corporate and government-funded projects like the brand initiative Marca Peru. In doing so, Yana cleverly details how Peru's marketing brand actually centers broader notions of mestizaje and specific criollo identities that are nationally recognized as part of Peronidad, despite the alleged centering of Peru's diverse ethnic qualities. Now I will show the music video, but please pay attention to Yana's fashion and ensemble, the lyrics, and the repetition of the chorus at the end of the video when Yana and her friends are dancing. Also, the lyrics are in my document if you want to look at them, but there's captions.
Esta es historia de un lugar lejano en donde todos se hacen llamar peruanos. Causa, ayunta, batería, hermano. Si eres mujer, palo reclamo. Acá se defiende la patria y el lomo saltado, la jerarquía en el poder y el ceviche de pescado. La fiebre del fútbol nos ha enfermado, nos importa más un gol que estar informados. Y en el extranjero, bien posicionados, Machu Picchu, las polleras y el festejo afroperuano. Pero acá adentro lo rechazamos por negros, cholas, indios y serranos. Bienvenidos al transporte urbano, en donde cualquier fulano se cree vagón por meterte mano. Después llega a su casa y juega el puritano. En la tomería no se confía, a mí me cuidan mis amigas, no la policía. En la tomería no se confía, a mí me cuidan mis amigas, no la policía. Entonces no me hablen de justicia cuando usted... Y después el aire cobrarnos y van a declarar y nos empezó a reducir la pena. Violadores para que no paguen su condena y van a culpar a la víctima aunque tenga 11 la nena. Al fin y al cabo una llamada y el juez ordena. Bienvenidos al transporte urbano, en donde cualquier fulano se cree bacán por meterte mano. Después llega a su casa y juega el puritano. En la tomería no se confía, a mí me cuidan mis amigas, no la policía. En la tomería no se confía, a mí me cuidan mis amigas, no la policía. En la tomería no se confía, a mí me cuidan mis amigas, no la policía. En la tomería no se confía, a mí me cuidan mis amigas, no la policía. En la tomería no se confía, a mí me cuidan mis amigas, no la policía. En la tomería no se confía, a mí me cuidan mis amigas, no la policía.
Sorry about the sound. I think it cut off, but hopefully y'all follow the lyrics. So even before Yana starts to sing, Marca Peru already challenges the liberalism of the brand and of the alleged democratic nation state. As the festive trap beats begin, a recording of a news clip saying, quote, "So what do you want then? To lower their sentence or to declare them innocent," end quote, shortly after Yana sings, quote, "This is the story of a faraway place where everyone calls themselves Peruvians, amigo, my man, my homie, my brother. And if you are a woman, there is no place for your claims," end quote. This first set of lyrics is accompanied with defiant close-up shots of Yana as seen in this slide that challenges the respectability, politics, the state privileges on nationalized television with their mainstream white and mestizo media anchors and novela stars. The initial recording snippet alludes to the rampant gender-based violence in the country and to the government's failure to adequately handle accountability. Consequently, Yana's lyrical beginning introduces Peru as a, quote, faraway place, end quote. This signifies the Western conception of the country as the almost, quote, mythical Andean land, end quote, filled with great culture, history, ruins, which Marca Peru markets. Further, the close-up shots of Yana's face demonstrates her hip aesthetics as oppositional, that transcends borders and crafts a unique form of libertary politic that is not tied to peronidad. Sporting a fuck racist necklace, chola and negra face tattoo, as well as a tattoo of the African continent outline, demonstrates how Yana challenges the anti-Black and anti-Indigenous rhetorics of a multiculturalism haven Marca Peru promotes, while the Peruvian nation state actively perpetuates structural racism. This is also seen in the fictitious where everybody, quote, where everybody calls themselves Peruvians, amigo, my man, my homie, my brother, and that calls out illusory notions of citizenship that all Peruvians claim a notion of belonging to the nation state and relationality while erasing the distinct identity markers that marginalize them. Oops, sorry. The sentiment is amplified in the next lyric stanza where Yana sings, quote, "Here the country is defended and the lomo saltado, the hierarchy in power and fish ceviche, football figure has made us sick. We care more about a goal than being informed. Abroad, well-positioned, Machu Picchu, the skirts, and the Afro-Peruvian celebration. But here inside, we reject each other for being Black, Chola, Indians, and Serranos," end quote. Here, Yana exposes the performative nature of this multicultural initiative by highlighting typical Peruvian markers that are recognized abroad and advertised as part of Marca Peru brand. This includes famous Peruvian cuisines such as lomo saltado, ceviche, the historical landmark, Machu Picchu, and the diverse ethnic makeup of the country represented with Afro-Peruvian dances and traditions. The representation of diversity and multiculturalism these markers provide are soon negated by Yana, singing that inside the country, Black and Indigenous Peruvians still face systemic racism and inequalities. In doing so, these lyrics demonstrate the expedient usage of multiculturalism in the Peruvian government, advertises abroad, and symbolically recognizes that these progressive, diversive markers belong in the map and not in the territory. In this vein, Yana recognizes that Indigenous and Black Peruvians have been excluded from privileges of the citizen subject and thereby of the human, replicated in constructions of Peronidad because of their simultaneous visibility, erasure, and systemic oppression in the country. In an attempt not to valorize gender-specific truths of the human, Yana refutes this facile flattening of diversity and inclusion of the Marca Peru brand and instead highlights that any iteration of the citizen reflects Peronidad and will always belong in the map. Given that the nation state fails to enact accountability and structural change, Yana repeatedly sings, quote, "In cops we do not trust. My friends take care of me, not the police," end quote. Not only do these lyrics reference the abuse and corruption of police forces in Peru, especially against its Black and Indigenous communities, it also signals the protection and care she receives is never from the state, but from inside her own community. When these lyrics are played for the last time in the video, the audience sees Yana and her friends having fun, dancing closely, twerking, and longingly looking at each other. The visible and invisible intimacies captured at the end of the video demonstrates kinships between people who are not structurally part of Peronidad. While Yana did not explicitly include queer issues in the song, the fashion and practices of the dancers and herself throughout the video imply a state of being that opts to focus on her community and on alternative ways to resist Yana's specific threats of the human by not revalorizing themselves in terms of the Peruvian citizen. In accordance with Sylvia Winter's take on liberalism within the nation state, Yana illustrates through lyrics and aesthetics how liberalism and its iterations of multiculturalism attempt to conceal violence as it reproduces violence. Productions with oppositional aesthetics such as Yana's Marca Peru not only help pave the way for mass consumption and awareness regarding deceptive national projects of inclusion, but also help create new possibilities for a being that does not consist of assimilating to the national discourse and thereby the human category. That's all for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, thank you so much, Silvana, for that beautiful presentation. I'd like to invite our next panelist, Priscilla K. Lugo. Priscilla K. Lugo, sorry, I'm trying to find the, okay. Priscilla K. Lugo is the daughter of immigrants from the South Texas border, living in a transnational family who believes in the potential of the borderlands as a site for transformation, aid, and care. Everyone, please help me welcome Priscilla K. Lugo.
Hi, everyone. Okay, can y'all see my screen okay? Wonderful, thank you. Okay, so thank you so much. I'm Priscilla Lugo. I'm a dual degree student in WGS and Public Affairs, and my presentation is on my thesis, Mexican asylum seekers and the marginalization they face in the US immigration system and how this marginalization perpetuates in between spaces. Before I begin, I do want to mention that at a point in my presentation, there will be mentions of child abuse, domestic, sexual, and LGBTQ violence, amongst other things. So I do want to provide a content note for folks. When those moments do arrive, I will notify the audience again so that they can prepare and take care of themselves accordingly. Let's see. There we go. I want to quickly go through how I will be presenting. I'm going to go ahead and open with my objective and 3 of my main research questions, then go into my methodology, then into 2 case studies from my thesis, and then finally into some policy recommendations. The asylum system was created in response to refugees created by World War II. However, there is a category for asylum that is usually the category that folks from Latin America rely on for their asylum cases, which is membership of a particular social group. For a particular social group identification, there must be evidence that you are visually a member of said group and that your membership within said group is integral to your own identity. And as a result, my research questions sought out to consider how immigration policy leaves Mexican folks in the margins of asylum, considering that a majority of their asylum cases are based on gender or gang violence. And finally, as someone from the border, I also wanted to consider the role the borderlands play in perpetuating an in-between space. Next, I will go into my methodology. And there are 4 components to my methodology. The first was interviews, where I conducted 15 interviews, 5 with children, 5 with mothers, and 5 with attorneys and service providers in the borderlands. The second was the utilization of feminist theory, namely Chicana theory, within Gloria Anzaldua's concepts and her ideas on Nepantla. The third was policy analysis of current U.S. immigration policy as it relates to immigration and asylum access, such as Title 42, the process of expelling individuals for public health concerns, metering, the process of customs agents turning back asylum seekers at the halfway points of ports of entry due to limited customs and border protection facilities to process individuals, causing wait lists on the Mexican borders, and the Humanitarian Asylum Process Review, otherwise known as HARP, which was the Trump-era immigration policy directly targeting Mexican asylum seekers and expediting their asylum process. And the final component is that of accompaniment and the role that I played in the lives of the folks I interviewed after we spoke. Next, I want to introduce Nepantla. And Nepantla, as defined by Gloria Anzaldúa, is a vague and undetermined place created by an emotional residue of an unnatural boundary. It is in a constant state of transition. And this vague space can be a site for growth or a site for pain, as folks are forced to wait here until their futures are decided by outside forces, like the asylum seekers I interviewed and worked with. And now for these next few slides, I just want to provide some scope of what the problem is. And between fiscal year 2005 and fiscal year 2016, there has been a 408% increase in Mexican asylum applications. And here you can see that the denial rate for Mexican asylum cases was 89% from fiscal year 2011 to 2019. And of those who do not have an attorney, only 16% receive a positive outcome. So this can be in the form of receiving asylum or just some other form of protection or not having to be deported. Next, I will go over some of my case studies, and this is where I will be discussing the sensitive material. So if you need to step away for a few minutes, please do so. In this slide, I'm going to be discussing Benjamin's case. Life in Guerrero for Benjamin was good when he was young. He was loved and cared for by his mother until she was murdered in front of him when he was 8. After his mother's death, his father abandoned him and he was forced to live with an aunt and uncle. His aunt and uncle were physically abusive and obligated him to work in order to pay for his stay with them. After a year or so of dealing with this, Benjamin finds Naya, another woman featured in my thesis, who takes him in and becomes his chosen mother. With Naya, Benjamin thrives. He's able to come out of the closet, return to school and work, and is living in a stable and loving home. However, as he gets older, things dramatically change when he is targeted and physically beaten for being gay one evening out on the street. This event scared both him and Naya, and this, coupled with the gang threats and violence they were enduring, is what triggered their migration to the border to seek asylum. However, life on the border wasn't easy either. They arrived during the pandemic, and because borders were closed, they weren't able to get on metering lists. And to make matters even more difficult, Benjamin was considered an unaccompanied minor because Naya was not his legal guardian. This proved difficult as Title 42 was found to not apply to unaccompanied children, and Benjamin had to make the difficult decision of whether or not to leave Naya behind. Naya encouraged Benjamin to cross the border and to stay with his maternal uncle, who was his sponsor. However, once that was decided, it took coordination from NGOs on the ground, researchers from an associated project, including myself, and an attorney to get customs agents to accept Benjamin into the United States. And despite policy dictating that it should have taken 3 days to process him, Benjamin was lost in the custody of the Office of Refugee Resettlement for 9 days, without his loved ones or attorney knowing where he was or how he was doing. These were the days in that the US saw an increase in unaccompanied children crossing the border, and videos of them being held in Border Patrol custody filled the news. And I personally scoured each and every one of them to see if I could recognize Benjamin or his clothing to get an indication of how he was doing. Once released, he went to live with his uncle in North Carolina. Life there wasn't easy. He lives in a rural area with limited access to social services. He has had to return to the closet out of fear of being turned away by his uncle, and he got into an argument with Naya, and they have lost contact with each other. His attorney that I and other researchers found for him filed for him to receive special immigrant juvenile status. She filed for the motion in July 2021 before his 18th birthday, and there has yet to be a decision on his case. Benjamin dreams of being a nurse, and he still holds on to that American dream that he will be free and at peace as a gay man. But he must wait. Wait to see if his application gets approved, wait if the country accepts him, wait to see if he will be let out of Napantla and allowed to begin his life. Next, we have Lisa, a 26-year-old mother. Life for Lisa was never easy. She grew up under intense physical abuse on behalf of her parents, which included beatings that left her unconscious. When she was about 13 years old, she ran away for the first time. Her parents found her soon thereafter and brought her home. Upon her arrival, the beatings worsened and she feared for her life again. She ran away after one particularly horrible beating, and she went to a friend's home in another city where she was drugged and raped. The rape resulted in a pregnancy. Once again, her parents found her and brought her back. Desperate to leave her parents, she found an older man who had recently returned from the United States who promised to marry her. She accepted his proposal and left to live with him. Her parents were furious and demanded that her husband purchase her from them, and discussions and prices were escalating when Lisa discovered she had become pregnant from the rape. After the pregnancy became known, discussions ended. However, immediately after she gave birth, her son was ripped from her arms and she never saw him again. Her parents and husband had sold her child, and she believes that they did so in order to settle the debt that was owed. After her pregnancy, Lisa lived under intense control and abuse from her husband. He would physically beat her, force her to sell drugs, and lock her in a room at all hours of the day, and threaten to take away their children if she didn't cooperate. In the end, she ended up trading 2 abusers for 1. Eventually, she ran away from him too. She went to another city where her husband's men found her and threatened her. Each time she relocated to a different city, and eventually her husband found her and attempted to force her to go back to him. She was able to call the police for help, but he was released from jail within 24 hours. That was when she made the decision to migrate. Her journey to the border wasn't easy. Her bus was attacked and shot at, and she lived under the intense fear that her husband would catch up to her and her children. Once at the border, Lisa finally felt safe. She and her children never left the shelter and felt at peace there. They arrived during the pandemic too, and so similarly could not get on metering lists, but were able to get into the United States under Title 42 exemption processes. Upon her release into the US, she went to New York City to stay with her sister. Her case was separated from that of her oldest son, who is 7. She was told by immigration officials that this was better because if her case got denied, she could still get asylum from the case of her 7-year-old son. And although New York City has universal representation for immigration cases, due to the ongoing pandemic, she was having difficulty finding an attorney. I helped her for weeks trying to put her in contact with attorneys and organizations who could take her case to no avail. Eventually, Lisa grew frustrated with my inability to help and stopped responding to my messages. Lisa also has dreams though, but hers are a bit different. She dreams that her son, a talented singer, will become famous on YouTube. She records him and wants to put up his videos online, but is scared that her husband will find her if she does. Lisa is navigating her newfound freedom while being mindful of the reach of her abuser, and she is unable to move on and start her new life, and so she remains in Napantla. And next, I have a few policy recommendations on how the immigration system can be more accessible, not only to Mexican asylum seekers, but all asylum seekers. The first would be to end metering. It is unethical and inhumane to force folks to wait in the country that they are attempting to flee. In the lawsuit Al Otro Lado, versus Mayorkas, a federal judge found that the practice was unconstitutional, and Customs and Border Protection rescinded the practice in November 2021. But as of February 2022, there are almost 30,000 asylum seekers on metering lists in Mexican border cities. The second would be to follow the precedent established under Title 42 exemptions. When Title 42 exemptions were being made, the federal government put NGOs directly in contact with Customs and Border Protection in order to select and process families into the country and assist in their travels to their final destination. When Title 42 exemptions ended, so did this collaboration. And so if metering lists are still being used due to limited CBP facility capacity, then Customs and Border Protection should collaborate once again with NGOs to facilitate and speed up this process to limit folks' time in detention and allow them to enter the country safely. And finally, I want to say thank you all for your time. I look forward to your questions and to your feedback.
Thank you so much, Priscilla, for that wonderful presentation. I am wondering if we have time for questions, if any of the moderators would like to chip in. And okay, so since like it's 2:03, I'm thinking we don't have time for questions. If like everyone wants to like drop their emails in the chat in case y'all do have questions, like please do, like panelists and like people who want to ask questions. Yeah, like great job everyone. Like thank you so much, like Paul and Patricia, for having me, and thank you to all our panelists. Can we like please like give it up for our panelists? Like just like Zoom claps.
Yeah, amazing job. Thank you to everyone who presented. Thank you so much, Mumtaz, for moderating. This was a very fun panel. I think from here on out, we have another panel at 2:30. So a smooth like 25-ish minutes to kind of like walk around, come in, come out, do as you wish. But thank you all so much for being here. We'll see you in the next panel.